Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Millicent Walker. We begin with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but there's some good news. Hailed as a first step to solving the global food crisis, Russia and Ukrainian officials have signed a deal in Istanbul, which will free up grain exports from Black Sea ports. The neighboring warring countries are among the world's biggest exporters of food, but Russia's invasion led to a de facto blockade of the Black Sea, resulting in Ukraine's exports dropping to a sixth of their pre-war level. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Ukraine's Infrastructure Minister Oleksandr Kubarakov were the signatories. The signing ceremony took place at Istanbul's lavish Dolmabahce Palace in the presence of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. The agreement is valid for 120 days, long enough to clear a backlog of up to 25 million tons of wheat and other grain stuck in Ukrainian ports. Speaking on the deal, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres described it as an agreement for the world.
Let there be no doubt, this is an agreement for the world. It will bring relief for developing countries on the edge of bankruptcy and the most vulnerable people on the edge of famine. We just signed opens up paths for significant volumes of commercial food exports from three key Ukrainian ports in the Black Sea: Odessa, Chebanovsk, and Yuzhny. The shipment of grain and food stocks into world markets will help bridge the global food supply gap and reduce pressure on high prices. The commitment and dedication are even more vital today. This initiative must be fully implemented because the world so desperately needs it to tackle the global food crisis. We count on the government of Turkey to maintain its critical role going forward, and I am here to pledge the full commitment of the United Nations.
And to the situation on ground, Russia has continued its strikes on Ukrainian military targets, according to the information released by Igor Konashenkov, Russia's defense ministry spokesman, while Ukraine says that it has blocked Russian military operations. According to Konashenkov, Russian forces struck multiple Ukrainian military command posts located in cities of Nikolaev, Kramatorsk, destroyed several ammunition depots of Ukraine in Donetsk, Nikolaev, and shot down several fighter jets of Ukrainian air forces. Ukraine State's new agency reported Thursday, citing the information released by Ukrainian military department, that the Russian military has been continuing its large-scale shelling in Sumy, Kharkiv, Luhansk and Donetsk, while Russian forces failed to make a breakthrough in the direction of Bakhmut and also failed to capture the Igorskosk power plant. Some Western countries have been continuing to increase military support to Ukraine. Well, to talk more about this good news and all that's happening with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, joining us right now is Mr. John Essing. He's a lawyer and anti-terrorism expert. He joins us virtually from London. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me, Millicent. Good evening.
Good evening. Just before we delve into the highlights of this week with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, breaking today is what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called a beacon of hope that would help ease the global food crisis. Were you surprised that both countries would come to sort of this agreement?
I was absolutely surprised. I didn't see that coming. I don't think many people did. But I think it had something to do with the tripartite agreement. That was some of the agreements that was just reached in Iran, because I know that Saudi Arabia has been the main nation, president of Turkey, negotiating for a corridor out of the Black Sea to transport the grains out. He went to Iran with Vladimir Putin, but he didn't get anything out of that alliance, even though it was an alliance. Iran got what it wanted, Russia got what it wanted, but he was left with nothing. So I think that was, in a way, just to appease him, because he wanted to he wanted a footprint in northern Syria to try and fend off the dissident PKK that he considers a terrorist group that has been at war with Turkey for some years now. But they turned him down. So I think this was just a gesture. So just so it doesn't look like he left there without anything. I think the most strategic, the other reason I think is that because he's looking for alliances now, he's been isolated by the West. He's looking for alliances elsewhere, which is why he went to Iran, and he has operational footprints for defense and security across Africa, especially the Sahel. And there are some African countries had warned him that they were the most affected by what was happening in Ukraine, by him holding up the grain. So I think that was part of. I think it's a strategic move because eventually he has to form those alliances. He has to form those strategic alliances across Africa on the basis of what he's lost. So I think for those main two reasons, that's why we got the surprise we got today. I didn't see it coming.
And you're also looking at other benefits for Russia, and that's also its fertilizers, which aren't under sanctions. But it also means exports of grain from Ukraine, vital for the war-torn nation. And, of course, many in the developing world who are at risk of famine will heave a sigh of relief. We understand that commodity prices have dropped after this announcement. But another thing here is the effect of, or perhaps the role that Turkey is playing and has played, and perhaps the future in terms of a solution to this crisis that Turkey can play in negotiating peace between Russia and Ukraine.
It depends on what the peace will look like. Ukraine does not want to cede any of its territory to Russia for any form of negotiations. That was the position on the 14th of February, on the 24th of February, sorry, and it hasn't changed. And it won't change because Russia is running out of ideas in Ukraine. It's despite the propaganda, it's suffering by the hands of the Ukrainians. I think the last time we spoke, I recall saying that they're waiting for weapons to come, for long-range weapons to come from the US when they were still in Donetsk. But those weapons didn't turn up. And so they were driven into Lysychansk and eventually driven all out of Luhansk Oblast, 50% of the Donbass completely. But now that the Russians have dug in and are preparing to take the rest of Donetsk, I think it's going to have a difficult time because those weapons have eventually turned up. They have the HIMARS now, they have the MLRSs, they have some heavy artillery as well, and a lot of shells. And Russia, on their part, have been using up approximately 30,000 shells, artillery shells a day. That amounts to a lot. And when you have a sanctions regime that includes not being sold anything connected to defense in the defense industry, defense or security, then you have a problem because a lot of what they use to manufacture some of their equipment are Western anyway. So if they lose a tank, for instance, based on a mechanical fault, it can't be repaired. That's the end of it. And they've lost a lot of personnel as well. So.
I was going to say that, looking at the level of bombardment, and so far Russia secured Luhansk, almost all of Donetsk, the industrialized parts of Ukraine has seen the biggest battle in Europe. Should Ukraine still maintain that it won't cede territories, what hope is there for Ukraine? Seeing as also after Russia just 2 days ago, I believe, said that they were expanding, they were going beyond what they had originally planned, seeing as Ukraine now has access to long-range weapons.
I think it's all propaganda because Ukraine has been doing a lot with, especially the HIMARS. Those HIMARS have a range of, I think, about 300 kilometers. And they've been able to reach behind enemy lines, destroying command control posts, destroying ammunition depots, destroying air defense systems, and some other things. So that has really impacted on Russia's advances coming forward, because they're depending on those infrastructure to carry out the war effectively. We don't hear much about what Ukraine is doing, but Ukraine is doing a lot of damage to the Russians. And for Russia to win this war, it has to do two things. It has to stop Ukraine from being mobile, and it has to kill its spirit to fight. And they've not been able to do either. So as long as Ukraine is prepared to fight, as long as the weapons keep coming, there's no end to near end to this war. And the West have recommitted themselves, to really supporting Ukraine, because I think that initially when this war started, I think the West was of the opinion that it's optional for them, that it's an optional intervention. They don't really need to interfere if they don't want to. But I think now they've come to the realization that the rules-based international order is really at stake here, and if as it is now, if Ukraine fails, then the West fails, and they can't afford that, because that will change the way we know life now. It will completely change everything, because that order will be substituted for the totalitarian, repressive policy priorities of revisionists like Russia, like Iran, like North Korea, and China. It's closest ally.
And finally, Mr. Essing, what ought to be NATO or the West's response without the risk of triggering a nuclear war? I think this was also recently, the Belarusian president was saying, quite surprisingly, that we must stop, reach an agreement, end this mess and operation in Ukraine.
I think that is a latent indicator to what Russia is suffering. And that announcement came when when Vladimir Putin was in Iran, and Iran was blaming the West as well for NATO, for the West starting the war. I think that that's not coincidental, that the Ayatollah Khomeini, I think that's what his name is, the supreme leader of Iran, and the Belarusian president tend to say the same thing, at about the same time. I think it indicates the pressure under which Russia is at the moment, despite the propaganda. But what the West is concerned about is doing too much, doing what they would view as too much that might trigger a nuclear war. I don't think there's any chance of that, because there are certain elements that would constitute a threshold, and if NATO or the West cross that threshold, that is when there can be a war. They will either have to target Russian forces in Ukraine, or they'll have to deploy combat troops into Ukraine against Russia with a NATO flag. And if none of that happens, then Russia cannot go to war with Ukraine under international law. I don't see NATO doing either of that. So as long as that does not happen, then I don't think there'll be a nuclear war. Because Ukraine is not a nuclear power anyway. It doesn't have any nuclear capabilities. The closest we came to having a situation like this was in 1962, I think it was, when the CIA reported to J.F. Kennedy, who was president of the U.S. at the time, that Nikita Khrushchev, who was president of the former USSR, has sneaked some nukes into Cuba. And when JFK found out, he told him to get the nukes out. They negotiated, eventually got them out in exchange for the US getting their nukes out of Turkey at the time. So there's only one nation with nuclear weapons, and that's Russia. So I don't think I don't think that will happen. Okay. Which is why the West needs to do more. They need to supply them with heavier weapons. They need to supply Ukraine with what it needs, especially now they realize that a loss for Ukraine is a loss for the West. It's not about Ukraine anymore. We always
appreciate your time. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. Mr. John Essing is a lawyer and anti-terrorism expert. Thanks again.
Thank you for having me, Minister. Bye-bye.
Ukrainian Navy sailors have been provided training by the British Royal Navy at an undisclosed location in Scotland. Ukraine's Deputy Defence Minister Volodymyr Havelov and British Armed Forces Minister James Happy watched over the training. British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace says the government will send scores of artillery guns and more than 1,600 anti-tank weapons to Ukraine to help bolster the country's defence against Russia. The boost comes after British Prime Minister Boris Johnson last month promised another £1 billion of military support, bringing total UK support to Ukraine since the start of the war, which Russia calls a special operation, to £2.3 billion.
Expecting to get 2 minesweepers, and we really need them to support Ukrainian efforts in the Black Sea for demining. It's also a part of the humanitarian mission, which is very important to the world.
Self-defense of the ships, and also, most importantly, these are specialist mine countermeasure vessels, so to be able to discover and destroy mines if they find them.
And on gas supplies, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has assured the German public that they will not be left alone to deal with the increased energy bills. She says you'll never walk alone, referencing, or rather he said, referencing the fan song of the Liverpool Football Club, synonymous with showing support and solidarity during a news conference in Berlin. Mr. Scholz announced earlier today that the country would rather avert the collapse of gas importer. In turn, starting this fall, Uniper will pass on higher gas prices to the consumers, leading to a possible 200 to 300 euro increase in the energy bill of an average family of 4. He said, "We overcome the difficult times together, that we stick together, that is crucial. No one is left alone with their challenges and problems, not one single citizen, not even the companies in this country," adding that together they are strong enough to manage this. So the world today on Channels Television, an offshoot of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The European Commission this week asked European Union member states to slash their gas consumption by 15% over the coming months to ensure that a complete cut-off of natural gas supplies from Russia will not fundamentally disrupt industries of the 27-nation bloc next winter. In a plan outlined Wednesday, the Commission proposed that the period of reduced gas consumption would last from August 1 to the end of March 2023. It has also asked for the part to impose mandatory reductions across the bloc if a union alert is announced when necessary. Several European governments, Spain, Portugal and Greece, voiced opposition on Thursday to EU plans to ration natural gas supplies in preparation for a shortfall. It comes as gas deliveries through the German-Russian pipeline Nord Stream 1 resumed yesterday morning after 10 days of maintenance. Deutsche Welle's Stephen Beardsley joins me now for more. Hi, Steve. Russia turned gas deliveries back on. So what's the problem?
That's true. Russia did turn back on gas deliveries for the single largest pipeline running to Europe, that is Nord Stream 1. But the crisis is far from over. The fear here is that, or the problem, I should say, is that the flows are reduced right now. So they're actually at less than half of the gas pipeline capacity. And that's a problem for European nations that are racing right now to fill up their reserves ahead of winter, the period in which there is the highest demand for that gas. Now, there's also the knowledge that Russia could continue to further throttle back supplies coming through the pipeline, or that they could turn it off altogether abruptly. There's also the added challenge of the fact that reduced flows, they make it harder in some ways for nations to prepare for a complete cutoff, because critics can always point to the pipeline and say, look, it's still running. Why do we need to take very strong savings measures right now? There is gas there, and Russia says that if X, Y, and Z are done, then the flows will increase. And so that's the kind of environment in which the EU is trying to prepare for these shortfalls right now. It's not easy.
And Steve, where is the disagreement again between EU members on this?
As in many topics that are difficult for the EU, it's about showing solidarity during problems that really affect one side of the bloc more than another. Now, interestingly, in this case, it's Germany that's really having the hardest time. More than any other nation, it's built its economy around cheap Russian natural gas. There are entire industries with large employee bases, with large downstream consumers that are heavily, if not completely reliant on cheap Russian natural gas. That includes households as well for wintertime heating. So any sort of disruption, major disruption, would be significant for Germany. Now compare that to Spain. In Spain, there's much less exposure to Russian natural gas. There's also much more alternatives. The infrastructure for liquefied natural gas exists in Spain in a way that it does not in Germany. There are no terminals to accept liquefied natural gas and to regasify it. In Germany, in Spain, there are multiple. So that's a big difference right there. We also know that with Spain, there is a reluctance to pass down too much burdens down to consumers, down to the people. We saw that before the beginning of the war, actually, as gas prices shot up from some market dynamics. We saw that Spain went ahead and intervened and that it capped gas prices that utilities could pass on to consumers. So that created a false market signal for consumers. It allowed them to pay cheaper, artificially cheaper prices, and that doesn't encourage saving. So that is a concern as well going forward, is that consumers aren't feeling a need to save and that Spain doesn't want to create those mechanisms for them to feel it.
And solidarity is important for Europe and also the West with this invasion. But how divisive could this issue be going ahead?
Yeah, it's already taken a sharp tone. The quote that made everyone's ears perk up yesterday came from the Spanish energy minister. She said in response to this plan to save 15% of gas for every EU member nation to do that, she said, look, Spaniards, unlike in other countries, are not living beyond their means when it comes to energy. Now, she was referring to Germany, obviously, but she was also making a not-so-coded reference to the kind of language that was used more than a decade ago for the euro crisis. That was when countries like Italy, Portugal, and Spain were in deep trouble due to mounting debt, due to mounting deficits, and lower revenues. At that time, Germany and other countries who were considered the thrifty nations of the EU, they tended to lecture those nations and say, look, you've got to, you put yourself in this situation, you were living beyond your means, and you need to straighten your books out. So it's very clear with that reference, we see how close to the surface old tensions lie. And that will be a challenge. That said, it's always been noted that the EU tends to come together during crisis. It's often said that it's forged further, it's progressed, it's pushed forward during difficult crises. And this case with European gas will be a crisis. It needs to see solidarity from EU members. You know, the final point I would make is that if Russia does turn off gas flows to Germany, for example, that's a major hub for the rest of Europe. The question there, will Germany continue to deliver gas downstream, even if it's coming from its own reserves? That will be a test of solidarity. Will Austria, which contains the major gas reserve for the southern German highly industrialized area of Bavaria, will it deliver gas to that region if new gas supplies are shut off in Russia? These are the questions that are going to really be the test of Europe and its solidarity.
We'll continue to keep tabs on the developments. Many thanks, Deutsche Welle's Steven Beardsley from Berlin there.